Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic? Let's do it. What's the most terrifying thing you've ever seen in real life? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. It's not the sight, but rather the feeling of ribs breaking whenever I start to do CPR on a person. It doesn't really get to me, but it's not a pleasant feeling either. This past week I had to do 2 CPRs, and one of my coworkers called me Donkey Kong later on because she heard the ribs break when I started compressions. As far as the most horrible sight, I pretty much lost it after a 30-hour sleepless flight and travel to attend my cousin's wake. We grew up together, and I was expecting him back in New York a few months before to move to Canada. To see his picture posted outside the chapel, then the coffin, the lights, the flowers, and then finally his body under that layer of glass. To see a patched up spot on his head where he was shot, I cried. I screamed. I fucking lost it. As of now, that was by far the most terrible thing I've seen. I work in a psychiatric hospital. There was this one patient who was secluded because she tried to kill a staff member. The patient was the most psychotic I've ever seen, and I've seen thousands of patients who were experiencing psychosis. The patient also enjoyed self-harm. As soon as we placed her in seclusion, she would hit her head as hard as she could against the metal door, breaking her face, teeth, and blood everywhere. She promised to do this every time we'd put her in seclusion. We've learned that she needed to be in a restraining bed as soon as she starts hitting herself. That's when she'd bite the inside of her cheeks and her tongue. Blood everywhere. She would visit the ER on a weekly basis, but few of her injuries could be treated because she wasn't complying with the treatment. She was heavily sedated with antipsychotics, but I guess that wasn't enough. I can still hear her scream in my head. I can see the blood and her severed cheeks held together by thin pieces of skin over the deep lacerations to the flesh of her cheeks. My brother lying in a hospital bed with nothing but a small hand towel covering his privates and breathing through a tube. This is hours after I got a call that he had fallen in a bad rock climbing accident. He took the brunt of a 30-foot fall with his head and wrist. F those bullshit companies that make those dinky-ass rock climbing helmets. That micro-thin piece of plastic shattered on impact. He was hooked up to ventilators. His face was a bit torn up, and he had a drain plugged into his skull. I still don't believe that was him. I still don't believe that was him. It's all so surreal, like I've never experienced. The phone call I didn't believe in. In some ways I had to call back just to have them reiterate what happened, hoping perhaps that I misheard. The experience is nothing like any movie I've ever seen. There are so many mundanities that strike you as unreal, such as having to yell into the intercom multiple times to have them let you into the ICU. Yes, I'm his brother. His brother, and the numbness that overtakes your body because you go limp with immediate grief when you realize what this new reality is. Even now, 5 months later, when I see him staring blankly at me in the 7th new bed he's been in, I still have to reach into the farthest corners of my brain to check and see if this really is really real. Maddeningly, it is. This is a mix of creepy and disgusting. When I was 14 years old, 31 now, we were visiting my grandfather's grave on the 1-year anniversary of his passing, December 23rd. This was the first immediate family death I've ever experienced in my life, so I wasn't sure how to process the emotions. This was my dad's dad, and I noticed how distraught he was. During our visit, I overheard him softly say, "What's so important about Grant and the Boulevard? If you're from the Northeast Philadelphia area, you know that intersection is notorious for major accidents." Again, I didn't know how to process my grief, so I clearly had no idea how my dad was doing. I figured he was just talking to himself. Fast forward to our drive home, we're approaching the infamous intersection, and my dad screeches on the brakes, despite our light being as green as could be. Now, at the intersection we're at, traffic to our left is coming up a small hill, so it's almost impossible to see cars until they reach their red light. Well, the car in the lane next to us goes through the intersection and gets T-boned by a truck going 40 to 50 miles per hour. I remember sitting in my passenger seat, and it was almost like it happened in slow motion. The truck flying through, the driver's side window of the victim's car became the canvas of a Red Jackson Pollock painting. We pulled off the road, and my dad told me to stay inside his truck. I sat there just staring at the blood-soaked window. I remember hearing my dad shout, "Jesus Christ, oh my God, oh my God." By this time, other people had pulled over to try and assist, including the driver of the truck who blew through the red light. The guy had all but a decent-sized cut on his forehead. Naturally, as a curious 14-year-old, I wanted to see what was inside the blood-soaked and bent-in-half car. I waited cautiously until my dad was distracted, and I snuck out to have a peek. As I snuck closer, the anticipation was killing me until I actually saw inside the car. Instant regret. Between the sight of visible bones, blood, tendons, and a skull cracked in half, which looked like hamburger meat, I immediately started vomiting and was caught by my dad. Now I knew why he wanted me to stay in the truck. Fast forward, past taking statements, etc., etc., my dad and I are finishing our ride home, and after he reprimanded me for sneaking out of the truck, I asked him how he knew that the truck was coming. He replied, "I heard Pop say, 'Stop now.' I don't know how I heard him, but I know it was him. I think he was talking to me at the cemetery too." At that point, it clicked for me. Prior to that, I had never believed in the afterlife or paranormal activity. Since that day, I've been a believer. I was sitting in the passenger seat while my mom and I drove down the highway. As we were driving, we approached a horse trailer that had tons of weirdly placed windows. It was bored, and I was bored, so I was looking at the trailer as we passed it, hoping to see a horsey. However, all windows were closed except one. It was the smallest and highest window, and as I stare at it, I see a face staring back at me. There was this guy who was staring directly at me through a window that was only big enough to show his face. I've been shot at, but that was the most horrifying thing, since it was just so effing weird. I don't have anything heavy like a war vet or 9/11, but camping can be effing scary. The first accident, I was lucky enough to not witness it happen, but the aftermath was gnarly. I was at the lake, skipping rocks, when all of a sudden, I heard my dad screaming in agony. I rushed back to camp to find a trail of blood leading back to the pop-up. Dad wasn't screaming anymore, but when I saw him, he turned around and said, "Hey, look at this axe, Jake." There it was, an axe just sticking out of his shin like a bone snapped out of his skin. Poor man started laughing, crying, pulled it out, then had Mom stitch it up. Poor guy was reduced to fishing and drinking on one leg for the rest of the trip. The second instance was also camping, but this time in a cabin. It was night and I had to pee. I leave the cabin and walk to the little creek that went through the campground, unzip, whip it out, and start to pee. Then all of a sudden I hear this heavy breathing and splashing. I see a baby bear drinking water, and I think nothing of it. Then all of a sudden I hear growling right in front of me. Mama Bear had walked up from the opposite side of the creek to drink some water too. This bear was so close that I could have pissed on it. I mentally shit myself and then calmly walked back to the cabin like nothing happened. I locked the door and then went back to bed. When I woke up the next morning, Mom was complaining that bears had scratched up the van. Turns out she left some food in there and they were looking for it the night before. The whole rest of the trip, all I could think was that I could have been bear food. I mean, an axe sticking out of your father's leg is pretty gruesome to see in real life, so yeah, it might not be a war story, but that's still moderately traumatizing, so seems like a tough dude though. Cool. When I was 19, I was living down in Phoenix, Arizona. I was eating lunch at a sandwich shop when I heard a loud screech and a thump. As I looked up at the sound of the screech, I saw an Astro-type van skid up onto the curb. My friend and I ran out to see if everyone was okay, and there was a guy lying in the middle of the road. The speed limit was 45, so the lady driving the van was probably doing 50 to 55. She kept saying, "He just ran out in front of me." The guy was jaywalking, and she hit him on the driver's side of the front of the van. The windshield was shattered, and the left post that the windshield connected to had a huge dent in it. A crowd was standing around the man on the ground. I went up to him, and the first thing I noticed was his shoes were gone. Then I saw the shin bone. It was sticking out of his leg a good inch or two. Blood had already started to coagulate due to the high temperature on the road. The temp that day was in the low hundreds, so I know the asphalt road was way hotter than that. His eyes were open, and all of the blood vessels were broken. No one had approached him yet, so I knelt down to take his pulse. When I pushed on his neck, blood came out of his eyes and his nose. That could have been a coincidence, but the timing was exact. I yanked my hand away before I could even tell if I felt a pulse or not, and blurted out, "Oh, he's dead." I really feel guilty for my reaction, but I was just surprised by the blood squirting like it did. When I said that, the lady that was driving the van started screaming. Just then an unmarked van pulled up and two paramedics of some kind hopped out. Not sure who they were, but it was not an ambulance. One of them looked at me and gave a disapproving look, which made me feel really bad about my reaction. The other one took the guy's pulse and said it was faint. They grabbed the stretcher and brought it over. When they lifted him onto it, a piece of his skull sort of flapped down, and there was the blood on the road that just sort of cooked there under his head. The medics looked at each other and at me and gave a weird look. To this day, I think they lied about the pulse just to calm the lady down, but I don't know. After speaking with the police, I went back to work, but told my boss I needed to go home. I felt really queasy and didn't feel like working another 4 hours. That was almost 25 years ago, and it is very vivid in my memory. And no, I don't know whatever happened to him. Sorry. Sleep paralysis. When I was 19, I had just called off of work as I had blown an 8-ball of coke the night before and was pretty beat. I had just dropped out of high school, so I was working full-time while my girlfriend, who I lived with, finished her senior year of high school. I remember waking up and hearing her voice calling my name, but I had a feeling it wasn't her. It sounded like there was a hint of a second voice behind it, projecting her voice. It's hard to explain. I couldn't really hear the second voice, I just knew it was there. I picked my head up and called out her name. No answer. I had literally just woken up, and I just assumed someone had the TV on downstairs, and I just lay on my stomach and tried to go back to sleep. Then I heard it again. I tried to pick my head up again, but this time I couldn't move. I don't mean like there was a weight on me preventing me from moving. I mean I was entirely unable to move, completely paralyzed, except my eyes for some odd reason. I lay there for a few moments as the voice got closer to me, sounding like it was coming down my hallway. The position I was in had my hand right in front of my face, so as I'm listening to this voice, I'm literally telling myself, "Move your index finger." I literally can't even do that. Finally, the voice sounds like it's right on top of me, and my heart starts beating like 1,000,000 beats per second, and I get covered in cold sweat because I can literally feel its presence near me. My dad is a pastor, and as you could tell from my previous night, I wasn't exactly in a good place in my faith. I thought to myself, this is a fucking demon. Literally the moment that thought crossed my mind, I felt hot breath on my ear. It felt like a blow dryer was pressed right against my ear, except the air was coming out super slow. I strained my left eye to look above me and saw the very edge of a gray arm. I thought to myself, I'm losing my fucking mind. And just like that, I could move, and the feeling was gone. I didn't hear about sleep paralysis until like 2 years later, and to this day I've read all kinds of shit about sleep paralysis. There's no explanation for it, but people experience it all the time in varying degrees. I don't know what it was, but I really hope it never happens to me again. When I was living in American Samoa in 2009, we got hit by a tsunami. We felt the earthquake, which wasn't that unusual. Lived in California for a long time, so you get desensitized. Great quake of 89 and all that. Anyway, we all ran outside. It was early in the morning, and I was prepping for a catering job later that day. My dad was going to take my 3 kids to school, but they were running late again. We get outside and stare at the ocean for a few minutes. Nothing happens. And we all go back inside. My parents are getting the kids ready, and I'm chopping veggies. Then my mom looks out the window and says, "All the water went away." And at first I was like, "Mom, that's not funny." And my dad walked over there, mumbling about her jacked up sense of humor. Then he freezes, and it's like slow motion. He's screaming, "Run!" And I jump over the counter, grab the kids by their shirts. They were 3, 4, and 5 years old at the time. And as we clear the side door and are running up the driveway, I can hear like a rumbling. I'm carrying the 3-year-old by her backpack, and my dogs are running in front of us. We were barefoot. And I remember stepping on a sharp rock or something, and it didn't even hurt. I was trying to make it across the field and up the mountain. When we start scrambling up the slope, it sounds like a train derailing. I heard screaming, "Tsunami!" While we ran, I didn't know the Samoan word, and everyone just kind of looked at me weird before they put the pieces together and started running too. The water came straight through the village and stopped about 10 feet away from where I was, on the side of the mountain, clutching grass and roots and dirt, trying to hold my kids and dogs against the face. I'm not religious, but I prayed that my grip would stay strong enough to hold us if the water came. The dogs were howling and whimpering. I could hear screaming, but it sounded far away. Afterwards, when I walked back down, there was an eel in the field and fish and coral everywhere, and my foot was bleeding badly. I left my kids higher up with their cousins. I felt like I was in a movie. In the movies, when something crazy happens, there's like a high-pitched whine beneath the surface, and you can't hear it, and you can't make sense of all the chaos. That noise or feeling happens in real life. Anyway, we all survived in my village. Both villages on either side of mine lost people, though.